The fire crackles beneath a spit of human flesh, smoke curling upward as bone snaps between teeth. The island is alive with the sound of waves crashing against jagged rock. But here in the heart of the jungle, the only rhythm is the chewing of men who feed on men. Outsiders once believed they could tame this place, that their ships and steel would protect them. They thought survival was a matter of strength, of will, of conquest. But the rules of civilization meant nothing here. The island swallowed arrogance whole, reducing invaders to ash, marrow, and memory. To understand why survival was nearly impossible, you need to see how the island itself became a trap. The island rises from the sea like a jagged wound, its cliffs blackened with volcanic stone that cuts sharper than any blade. There is no gentle beach to welcome you, only shards of rock where waves slam with relentless fury, pulling the careless under. From a distance, it looks like paradise, green hills draped in mist, palms swaying beneath a golden sun. But step ashore, and the illusion dies. This is no Eden. This is a prison. The air itself conspires against you. Heat presses down like a suffocating weight, damp and heavy, sinking into your skin until sweat becomes a constant second layer. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds thick enough to darken the air, each sting carrying fever, delirium, and death. The ground is never steady, either slick with mud that sucks at your ankles or covered in roots that twist like snares. Every step demands caution, and every pause brings new torment. At night, the storms arrive. Thunder splits the sky as rain slashes down in sheets so heavy it feels like drowning on land. The winds roar through the trees with a voice like the ocean itself, tearing branches loose, scattering fire, and driving the unprepared into panic. Shelters collapse, fires die, and the darkness closes in. You would think morning brings relief, but the dawn only reveals more dangers hidden in the green. The jungle is endless, a choking labyrinth where the sun barely pierces the canopy. The air smells of wet earth and decay, the sweetness of rot mixed with the musk of unseen animals. Birds shriek overhead with calls that sound more like laughter, and monkeys throw fruit or worse from branches, mocking intruders. Every sound carries an edge of menace, because silence is even worse. In silence, you know something is watching. Water shimmers in streams that look pure, but drink too quickly and your body revolts. Parasites and disease hide in every drop. Food appears plentiful bright fruits, crawling crabs, roots pulled from the mud, but each choice could poison you. Eat the wrong berry, and your throat closes. Bite the wrong fish, and your skin burns with fever until you collapse. Hunger is constant, but so is the risk of satisfying it. The island tempts you, then punishes you for trusting. And then there are the traps you cannot see. A vine that looks harmless but conceals thorns filled with venom. A pit hidden beneath leaves, dug by hands that know this terrain far better than you ever could. Even the animals are weapons here. Snakes slide through the underbrush, their scales blending with shadows, while crocodiles lurk in rivers that seem calm until the water explodes around you. Every inch of land hides fangs. To outsiders, the island promised riches, new territory, or adventure. To those who tried to survive, it revealed its true nature. It was not just a piece of land, it was an enemy. A relentless, suffocating, unyielding force that demanded everything from the body and still took more. The landscape itself hunted you, testing the limits of your endurance, stripping away pride until only fear remained. And yet, for all its cruelty, the island was not empty. Among the cliffs, the rivers, the endless green, there were eyes, watching, waiting, measuring the weakness of every stranger who staggered ashore, exhausted and desperate. Because the land wasn't the worst danger. The people were. They did not see themselves as monsters. On this island, cannibalism was not madness. It was order. It was faith. It was survival. The society of flesh-eaters was built on ritual, every act steeped in meaning older than memory. When warriors returned from a hunt, their bodies painted in ash and blood, they were not greeted with fear but with reverence. Children gathered to watch as captives were dragged into the village, their cries drowned out by drums that thundered like the heartbeat of the earth. To kill was not merely conquest. It was ceremony. At the center stood the elders, men and women scarred by years of battle, their skin carved with patterns that told the story of lives consumed. Around them, shamans cloaked in feathers and bone chanted to the spirits of the island, calling on ancestral power to bless the feast. Firelight danced across their faces, distorting them into masks of gods and demons. The smell of smoke mingled with the copper tang of blood, thick enough to choke outsiders who dared to breathe it. For the islanders, it was the scent of life itself. Cannibalism was more than hunger. The island provided fruit, fish, roots, and meat, but human flesh was something different, something sacred. To eat an enemy was to take their strength, to strip them of defiance, to ensure their spirit could never return in vengeance. Warriors believed the marrow of the bones gave courage, the heart carried power, and the brain bestowed wisdom. Flesh was not food. Flesh was inheritance. Hierarchy enforced this truth. The first cuts of meat belonged to the chiefs, who ruled not by wealth but by their ability to command fear and loyalty. Shamans received the organs, believed to hold the essence of life, fueling visions and prophecy. Warriors took what remained, feeding muscle with muscle, strength with strength. The women and children ate last, but even they partook, for to refuse was to deny the gods. Ritual killings were designed to terrify. Captives were painted in bright colours, their bodies smeared with oils, their faces marked with symbols of death. They were paraded through the village, mocked and taunted, their fate a spectacle to unite the people. Songs rose, voices weaving together in a chorus that shook the jungle, echoing against cliffs until the very earth seemed to join the ritual. The condemned were forced to dance, stumbling to the rhythm of drums, until exhaustion broke their strength. Only then would the blades fall, obsidian, sharp and merciless. The aftermath was not chaos, it was order. Fires burned hot, flesh roasted, fat dripping into the flames with a hiss. Smoke spiraled into the night sky, carrying prayers to unseen gods. Children were taught to watch without fear, to understand that what happened here was not horror but heritage. Their first taste of human flesh was not delayed until adulthood. It was given as initiation, a moment of belonging, proof that they too carried the island within them. To outsiders, this society seemed savage. To those who lived it, it was balance. Each feast honoured the ancestors, each sacrifice secured survival. The island was merciless, and the people matched it with merciless devotion. In their eyes, outsiders who stumbled ashore were not men. They were offerings, gifts delivered by the sea itself, proof that the gods still favoured the island. The jungle concealed their villages, but the memory of screams carried far. Travellers spoke of fires burning at night, of drums rolling like thunder, of smoke that smelled not of animals but of humans. They whispered of eyes gleaming in the dark, of warriors who moved like shadows, and of the silence that followed because none who were taken ever returned. And when outsiders stumbled ashore, they weren't met with curiosity. They were met with hunger. The first outsiders came with confidence. Their ships creaked against the tide, sails snapping in the wind as they scanned the green island rising before them. To their eyes it was untouched land, ripe with timber, fish, and promise. The air smelled of salt and fruit carried from the jungle, and they believed they had found fortune. The men whispered of conquest, trade, or perhaps even settlement. They did not whisper of danger, for they could not imagine it. When they set foot on the blackened rocks, the islanders were waiting. Not with spears raised, but with smiles. Women adorned in bright shells stood at the shoreline, necklaces of bone and coral offered as gifts. Children laughed, pointing at the tall, pale strangers as if they were performers in some divine play. The warriors hid their weapons in the tree line, their faces painted in patterns of welcome. The explorers felt relief. Here was not hostility, but hospitality. The first days seemed almost idyllic. Islanders brought food, roasted fish, coconuts split open with practiced ease, fruits sweeter than anything the sailors had known at home. Fires burned warm at night, drums beat in celebration, and the air was alive with song. The explorers joined in, clapping to rhythms they did not understand, drinking from carved bowls until their heads spun. They laughed at their own fears, declaring this land tame, these people generous. But generosity was a mask. The islanders had studied them. They saw the weapons, the sickness of the sea on the outsiders' faces, the arrogance in their laughter. They saw not conquerors, but prey. It began in whispers. A sailor missing at dawn, another who stumbled into the jungle and never returned. The outsiders blamed accidents, the sea, wild animals. Yet unease crept through their camp, carried by the strange way the islanders watched them when the songs ended. Smiles lingered too long. Eyes glittered like knives. The gifts continued. but so did the vanishings. Then came the ambush. One evening, the explorers were invited to a great feast. Fires blazed higher than before, drums thundered louder, and the air was thick with smoke that stung their throats. The food was plentiful, too plentiful. Bowls overflowed with roasted meat, the fat dripping, the smell rich and heavy. The sailors devoured it, drunk on the warmth of fire and drink, their laughter echoing into the trees. They did not notice how the islanders ate slower, watching, waiting. At the peak of the night, when the drums stopped all at once, the traps snapped shut. Warriors emerged from the darkness, obsidian blades glinting, spears tipped with bone. The smiles were gone, replaced with snarls. Nets dropped from the trees, weighted with stones, pinning men before they could rise. Screams tore through the celebration, the sound drowned by the sudden roar of voices chanting, chanting, chanting. The outsiders fought, but their weapons were far, their swords dulled with salt and rust. Panic scattered them, and the jungle closed in like a living wall. Those who ran were hunted by shadows that knew every route, every stone, every turn. Those who were caught alive were dragged back toward the fires, their cries twisting with the beat of renewed drums. The feast had only begun. For the survivors, realization struck too late. The generosity had been a theatre, the welcome a performance. They had not been guests, they had been offerings. And as the fires burned into the night, smoke carrying the scent of roasted flesh into the sky, the island swallowed yet another story of arrogance. The lesson was brutal and absolute. Survival here was never guaranteed, because the true power of the island was not its storms or its jungles, it was its people. What came next would erase any illusion of safety. Captivity began not with chains, but with rituals. The outsiders who survived the first slaughter were bound in ropes of woven fibre, dragged across the earth until their skin tore. They were paraded through the village as trophies, their bodies smeared with ash and painted in vivid streaks of red and yellow. To the islanders, this was not cruelty, it was preparation. Every captive had to be stripped of identity before they could be consumed. The sounds were relentless. Drums beat in steady waves, echoing the pounding of the prisoners' hearts. Songs rose in layers, high-pitched chants twisting with deep-throated growls, the harmony meant to mimic the voices of gods. Children joined the chorus, stamping their feet in the dirt, laughing as captives stumbled past. The jungle itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm, its canopy shivering with every crash of drumskin. In the centre of the village, a great fire burned. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of roasting meat. To those bound at the edge, it was unmistakable, the sweet, greasy smell of cooked human flesh. The realization struck harder than any blow. They had not been brought here for trade, nor for ransom. They were food. Before the feast, terror was sharpened by spectacle. Shamans cloaked in feathers and skulls circled the captives, daubing symbols on their foreheads with blood. They whispered prayers, their voices hissing like serpents, their hands shaking rattles filled with bone. Warriors danced around the fire, stamping their feet, brandishing spears that glinted in the flames. Their movements were both violent and precise, each step designed to break the spirit of those who watched. Captives were forced into the performance. Some were made to dance until they collapsed, their exhaustion mocked by laughter. Others were led past racks of bones strung together like wind chimes, clattering with each gust of air, a reminder of the fate awaiting them. Skulls stared from posts at the edge of the firelight, their hollow sockets filled with ash. Every symbol screamed the same truth. Death here was not an end, but a transformation into ritual. The first blow was never swift. Obsidian blades carved shallow wounds, streaks of red glistening under the firelight as prisoners cried out. Blood was smeared across the warriors' faces, across the children's chests, sealing the bond between victim and tribe. Then came the final cut. Throats opened, screams silenced, bodies falling into the dust. The crowd roared, their voices rising with the flames, a single violent chorus celebrating the gift of flesh. The butchery was methodical, limbs severed, organs removed with reverence, bones cracked open to spill marrow into waiting gourds. Fat sizzled as it dripped into the fire, hissing like the voice of the gods. The bodies were divided according to custom, each cut a sacred act. Chiefs claimed the choicest portions, shamans the organs, warriors the muscle. Nothing was wasted. Even the bones were polished, carved and hung as ornaments, proof of victories etched in bone and smoke. To the captives who remained alive, forced to watch, the horror was worse than death. The screams of their companions mixed with the sound of chewing, of teeth grinding through roasted flesh, of laughter rising with each bite. The smell clung to their skin, to their hair, to the very air they breathed, until they could taste it on their tongues without swallowing a thing. They prayed for escape, but there was none. The island devoured hope as surely as it devoured men. Yet not every outsider broke. Some clenched their jaws, hiding their terror behind silence. Some studied their captors, searching for weakness in ritual, waiting for a moment when panic could become defiance. They knew that to die here was to be erased, transformed into smoke and bone. But if even one could resist, if even one could fight back, the story might change. But some outsiders fought back, and that resistance would change everything. Defiance never began with strength. It began with desperation. Those who survived the rituals of terror carried fear in their bones, but fear sharpened into resolve. Escape was not a choice. It was the only way to avoid becoming firewood and flesh. The first acts of rebellion were small. A shard of obsidian palmed during a ritual, hidden beneath blood and dirt. A rope gnawed through under cover of chanting. Outsiders whispered to each other in stolen breaths, trading scraps of hope the way starving men trade crumbs. Every movement had to be silent, every thought disguised. The islanders were watchful, but they underestimated the hunger of those who had seen their own fate roasting over fire. One night, during a storm that drowned the sky, a group of captives broke free. Rain lashed against their skin as they slipped from their bindings, mud swallowing their footprints. The jungle offered no kindness, only darkness and danger, but it was better than the fire. They sprinted through trees that clawed at their flesh, hearts hammering louder than thunder, pursued by voices raised in alarm. For a few fleeting hours, freedom seemed possible, but the island had its own traps. The river was swollen from the storm, currents raging like a beast. Some were dragged under, their screams lost in the roar. Others collapsed, too weak to go on, their bodies claimed by the jungle before the hunters even arrived. By dawn, the survivors were few. Huddled in the dripping undergrowth, shivering, bleeding, yet alive. When the hunters found them, the fight was unlike anything the islanders expected. Armed with stolen spears and sharpened stones, the outsiders struck first. They drove weapons into flesh with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The ambush was sudden, brutal. Warriors fell, their blood mingling with rain, their confidence shaken. For the first time, the islanders saw prey bite back. The victory was not decisive, but it was symbolic. The captives who escaped that night became more than fugitives. They became stories. Among themselves, they whispered of comrades who fought like demons, who killed their captors before disappearing into the jungle. Among the islanders, a new legend spread that outsiders, though weak and clumsy, could draw blood, could defy the gods. The balance shifted, not in power, but in fear. Resistance grew in fragments. Some captives poisoned food with berries gathered in secret. Others used fire not as ritual but as weapon, setting huts ablaze under cover of night. The jungle, once their prison, became their ally. Traps meant for outsiders were turned against their makers. Pits swallowed hunters. Vines became nooses. Stones rolled from ridges crushed the feet of pursuers. Survival demanded savagery, and the outsiders learned quickly. But the islanders adapted too. For every escaped captive, they tightened their rituals. For every stolen weapon, they crafted more. They struck harder, hunting fugitives with greater ferocity, their chants carrying through the night like hunting calls. Outsiders who resisted were never forgotten, their corpses displayed with greater spectacle, their deaths reminders that defiance carried a price. Still, the seed of defiance had been planted. Even as many perished, whispers of rebellion lingered, echoing across ship decks and distant ports when survivors somehow made it back to the sea. They spoke of cunning over brute strength, of nights spent hiding in trees, of battles fought with nothing but rocks and stolen knives. Their voices carried the truth. Survival here was not impossible, but it demanded a cost so great that few were willing to pay it. And those who did survive bore scars that were more than flesh. They had watched fire consume friends, smelled roasted flesh that once bore names, heard the laughter of children over screams of the dying. Survival was not triumph. It was a wound that never healed. Yet even survival came at a cost, because escape only led to more suffering. The myth of invincibility could not last forever. For generations, the cannibal tribes ruled their island with blood and fear. But even the most ruthless societies are not immune to collapse. What outsiders could not destroy with swords, time, and sickness began to unravel. The first cracks came from within. Rival chiefs waged war over captives, each feast becoming a contest of dominance. Villages turned on one another, raiding not for resources but for bodies. The rituals that once united the people now splintered them, their hunger feeding division as much as strength. Blood no longer bound them together, it tore them apart. Then came the foreign diseases, invisible invaders that struck harder than any spear. Sailors who escaped the island carried more than stories. They brought back fevers, coughs, and plagues that found their way back to the cannibals through later contact. Flesh-eaters who had thrived for centuries began to fall in droves, their chants silenced by sickness no ritual could cure. The shamans promised healing, but their gods remained silent. Faith cracked as bodies piled high. Weapons followed. Muskets and steel, traded or stolen, tipped the balance. The islanders who once mocked the clumsy blades of outsiders now faced firepower that split the air and tore through bone. Spears shattered against iron. Shields burned under gunpowder. Outsiders no longer stumbled ashore helpless. They came armed with fear sharpened into vengeance. Stories of the cannibal island spread faster than ships could sail. Sailors whispered of nights filled with drums and smoke, of men devoured under starlight. These tales grew in retelling, transforming into legend that painted the island as cursed, unholy, untouchable. Even those who never saw it firsthand trembled at its name. The myth of cannibal shores reshaped the maps of explorers, steering them away, forcing them to chart longer, safer routes, rather than risk the fate of being consumed. And yet, the terror gave the islanders power. For a time, their reputation alone was enough to keep enemies distant, their shores avoided like plague. But fear is a double-edged blade. It preserved them in isolation, while at the same time ensuring they would never expand, never grow beyond the limits of their prison. Fear trapped them as surely as the cliffs and waves had trapped outsiders. In the end, neither side truly won. The cannibals lost their strength to disease and gunpowder. The outsiders carried scars in their minds, nightmares of fires and feasts that haunted them across oceans. The myth collapsed, but its shadow remained. The island was no longer a kingdom of hunters and rituals, yet its legend continued to shape the world far beyond its shores. But the legacy didn't end in blood, it etched itself into human memory. Fear has a way of outlasting flesh. Long after the fires of cannibal feasts burned to embers, long after the last drums fell silent, the stories of the island lived on. They spread like smoke across oceans, carried by sailors who swore they had heard the screams, smelled the charred meat, seen the eyes of hunters glinting in the dark. Some lived it, others only repeated what they had heard. But the legend was enough. The cannibal islands became symbols of the unknown places where maps ended and nightmares began. To travellers, they embodied the savage edges of the world, proof that beyond the reach of civilization lay dangers no ship's cannon or kingdom's lore could contain. The very idea of them reshaped exploration. Captains changed their routes, merchants whispered prayers before crossing certain waters, and colonial empires weighed the cost of expansion against the terror of losing entire crews to smoke and bone. Fear was a weapon. It deterred, it warned, it created distance. For some cultures, it even justified conquest. Colonizers painted cannibal societies as monstrous, using their practices to brand entire peoples as inhuman, as creatures who could only be subdued or erased. The legend became propaganda, a story repeated not to warn, but to control. Yet beneath the layers of exaggeration and distortion, the truth remained. On those islands, survival had never been about strength. It had been about endurance, cunning, and the willingness to abandon humanity itself. But there was another legacy, one carved not in politics or conquest, but in memory. The few who escaped spoke of hunger so deep it changed the way they looked at food forever. They described nights haunted by the sound of chewing, by the smell of smoke that never left their skin. Their descendants carried those memories like ghosts, cautionary tales told to children in hushed voices. Do not trust the welcoming smile. Do not mistake beauty for safety. The ocean hides places where men vanish, where mercy is devoured with the body. For the islanders themselves, the legacy was different. Some clung to fragments of ritual even as time eroded their way of life. They remembered the chants, the dances, the the belief that flesh carried power, but others saw only ruin, disease, invasion, and the weight of being remembered not for their language or their craft, but for their appetite. They became symbols against their will, trapped forever in stories that painted them as demons rather than humans who had shaped a way of survival in a merciless land. Yet myths survive because they strike at something deeper. Cannibal islands frightened not only because of what they were, but because of what they revealed about us. They stripped away the thin veil of civilization, forcing the question, what would you do, stranded on a rock where the jungle kills, the sea imprisons, and hunger never sleeps? Would you hold to your laws, your morals, your fragile notions of decency, or would you eat, as they did, and call it survival? That is the true horror. Not the fire, not the screams, not the blood, but the recognition that survival demands choices civilization does not forgive. The cannibals lived that truth. Outsiders stumbled into it, too late to escape, and those who carried their stories forward ensured that humanity would never forget. So when you hear the ocean crashing against a distant shore, remember this. Some islands were never meant for survival.